Hey everybody, Jane here, and I'm coming to you today with my November wrap-up. During the month of November, I read 10 books, and I also DNF'd 2. Of the books I read, 2 of them were graphic novels, everything else was nonfiction, and I was participating in Nonfiction November, although that didn't go quite as planned. So I think I am going to do things a little bit different with this wrap-up. Instead of starting off with my DNFs, I'm going to go ahead and do the graphic novels, since they will be the only items that are not nonfiction. If you don't want to hear about any specific book, go ahead and the time stamp should be below. Just skip on to the next one. The first book I read, the first graphic novel I read was Mooncakes. This is about a witch and her friend who is a werewolf, who is non-binary, and they are trying to deal with a demon/monster that has shown up in the town that she lives in and they were from originally. So this was really cute. I had a good time. The art is absolutely gorgeous. I love the representation. It was just a cute, fun, sweet read. I gave it a 4 out of 5. It wasn't my favorite. It wasn't the most amazing thing ever, but I had a really good time with it, and I did pass it on to my daughter, who is also having a good time with it. The other graphic novel I read was Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. If you've been following my channel, you know I really enjoyed the Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies book and movie. This I did not enjoy as much. I gave it a 3 out of 5. I felt that the graphic novel was not a great medium for this story. One of the challenges is that it is told in black and white, and a lot of the characters look very much the same, so it can be very difficult to figure out who's who they're talking about, who they're talking to. I just found it confusing. There was also massive time jumps. I did not enjoy this nearly as much as I expected to. So I will admit I was a little bit disappointed, because I really enjoyed the book Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies and the movie Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, but the graphic novel, it wasn't not a hit for me. All right, of the ones that I DNF'd, they were nonfiction. And the first one was my sport read, which ended up being Shoes: A Brief History. This is a book about shoes, and basically it has beautiful pictures and lots of information that is honestly pretty dull to read. I got about halfway through and I just was like, this is not interesting or entertaining for me. This is a book I would use probably as a reference for what kind of shoes were in use at the time, and maybe to see pictures of those shoes. But to read it as a book, I just couldn't do it. So this ended up being DNF'd. I ended up also DNFing my original choice for design, and that was Our Dogs, Ourselves. As a lot of you know, dogs have been selectively bred to be man's best friend. I love dogs, and I really thought this book would be up my alley. Turns out, not so much. So this book, as far as I got, is about our relationships with dogs. And I think it ended up just being a little bit odd for me. The first chapter, I believe, was about us naming dogs and how when we name something, we turn it from something to a personification. We connect with it, it gives it personality, it gives it a certain level of individuality and the importance of naming our dogs. And there was a lot of talk about the different names that have been used, and it was interesting, it was fine. Then we got to later chapters, and I stopped when we got to the discussion of whether dogs should be granted personhood and the complexities of our laws in regards to humans and animals and our dog's property, our dog's people. How do we deal with these things that are obviously more than property. They are sentient. And, law-wise, we can do almost anything to our dogs. There are abuse laws, but other than that, you can leave a dog on the side of the road. You can mistreat a dog to a certain degree. And all of these things, dogs just don't have the rights of a person. However, a dog is also a dog and not a person, and it complicates the law. I'm not sure what didn't work for me. I think I wanted a happy-go-lucky read about dogs, and this was just not what I was looking for. It didn't give me the feels. It didn't give me anything I loved about it. It was maybe too cerebral for what I was looking for. But I did not enjoy this book, so I didn't finish it. All right, so now that those are out of the way, let's go back to the prompts for Nonfiction November and what I did end up using instead. So I traded out my sport one, which originally was the shoe book, for the Murdoch mysteries. And this is a bit of a stretch, but one of the old ways you could use the word sport had to do with entertainment in general. And this is a book about a TV show. I believe it had something to do with the way I was reading it. It was archaic for something like theater or just entertainment in general. So this is going to count even if it doesn't really. This is just an official companion to the Murdoch series. I gave it a 4 out of 5. If you love the Murdoch series, this is probably worth reading. It just looks into the characters, it has some great pictures, it talks about some of the things they did in the series, some of the challenges with picking clothes and how they chose the right clothes for each character, what they were trying to do with the characters, and it goes from season 1 to season 8. I do recommend reading this only after you have watched up to season 8. I have only watched through season 3, and so there were some spoilers. But I knew that going in, and spoilers are not a big deal to me. So, I was still excited to read this, even though, I hadn't got that far. If you don't like the Murdoch mysteries, this isn't for you. I think everybody who likes mysteries should like the Murdoch mysteries, because I just love this. But, yeah, 4 out of 5. It was fine for what it was. Alright, so the next topic was design. And for design, I'm checking what it was called. I read One Click Cover. One Click Cover is a nonfiction book about cover design for writers. It is one that I was given an ARC for. It's part of the Sterling and Stone family of books. It was good. It had to do with what to look for in a cover. When you're buying covers for your books, it had a lot of examples in it. It kind of showed what should pop, some of the different color usages, what should be on the cover, what shouldn't be on the cover, how to talk to a cover designer. It was good. It was 4 out of 5 if I didn't mention that before. The only thing I will say is I read it on a black and white Kindle because my Kindle doesn't have color, and you can't get the full effect of this book on a black and white Kindle. So if you are reading it, make sure you read it on something that has color. It was fine. It was good. It was, again, a book for writers about choosing cover art and knowing whether your cover art is any good. I had a good time with it. The next one I read was for True, and I read The Real Lolita, The Kidnapping of Sally Horner. And this book is about the historical kidnapping of a little girl named Sally Horner that has some ties to Lolita, the book. So it has a lot of similarities, although the author denied basing his book Lolita on this true crime thing happening. My biggest issue, I think, with it, I gave it a 3 out of 5. I think it was one of my lower rated nonfiction this month. My biggest issue is there really isn't a lot of information, and the author basically says that. We don't know a lot about what happened to Sally Horner. She was kidnapped when she was, I believe, 9 and returned at 13. However, she passed away at 15 years old. So a lot of what happened to her during her kidnapping and the particularities of it, we just don't know. It is kind of a disturbing book because the author focused a lot more, I will say, on Lolita and the author of Lolita, and kind of, I felt like their thoughts about the book not, like it shouldn't exist, or it being problematic. And I'm sorry, any book about a pedophile is going to be problematic. That's not really news. If you are picking up a book and know that Lolita is about a pedophile, you should expect problematic. So I just felt like this book really didn't do it for me. It didn't do it for me for telling me much about Sally Horner. It didn't convince me that Lolita was based on this book, and it didn't give me a lot of insight into Lolita either. I had read Lolita years ago, nothing recent, and maybe that would have changed how I felt about this, but it ended up just being kind of a meh. Now, there is a fictionalized version of Sally Horner's story that I do plan on reading, and I'm hoping that gives me a little bit more insight into her as a character. The other thing I will say, I felt like there was part of it that was going to be a little bit, or that was a little bit misleading, or trying to make you think that one thing was going to happen when another thing happened, particularly how Sally Horner ended up passing away. Since this is history, I don't feel like it's a big spoiler. You can see this on Wikipedia. She died in a car accident. It had nothing to do with the situation that she'd been in, but the author kind of presented it in a way that made me think that maybe she killed herself due to what had happened. She mentioned that she was depressed and all this other stuff, but again, we don't have a lot of accounts, and even the author, the people that she has been able to interview were not people who were really there at the time. Sally's family is gone except for a niece who was very, very young. It just, I don't know. It felt like there maybe wasn't enough there to write the book. We did it anyway, but there wasn't necessarily enough there. The next book I am going to talk about is my one for voice. And I decided that that was Tell Me Where It Hurts by Nick Trout. And this is where Nick Trout is a fiction author who I had read several of his fiction books, really loved him, and decided that I was going to read a nonfiction. This is good. It is a day in the life of a veterinarian and the different things he goes through on a daily basis with helping these animals. He has patients that don't have a voice, so he has to use clues and the things that their owners say to basically give voice to these creatures to figure out what is happening to them and how they are sick and what is wrong with them. I gave this a 4 out of 5. It was a good time. If you enjoy James Herriot, this is very James Herriot-esque, although it is more modern. I love James Herriot, so I was pretty prone to love this. I had a good time. I will say my main complaint is that I did like the fictional books a little bit better than the nonfiction. Also, this isn't a true day in the life of, and he does tell us that in the front page. He's like, I created this day in the life based on real things that have happened to me and my colleagues and real cases we've had, but this is not like an actual day I lived. He does get to follow up with patients, so he knows a little more about how things turned out as well, which was nice. My big complaint, though, was that he did take a lot of detours. This author likes to, start telling us about this, and then we're going to veer off into 5 different directions before we come back to that. And I did find that a bit distracting as I was reading it, and to be brought back to, oh, okay, yeah, we were talking about this dog 5 dogs ago, but this is still where we are. So it was good, it was interesting. Again, if you are a fan of James Herriot, you'll probably like this. Little bit, sometimes, detoury. Alright, so those were the 4 prompts. I did read a couple other nonfiction books as well. One of them was From Here to Eternity by Caitlin Doughty. I'm a big fan of Caitlin. I read her other book, Smoke Gets in Your Eye and Other Stories of the Crematory. And I am reading with my children, Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs? This is an interesting book about different customs and ways that people deal with death. There are cultures where the family goes back and takes the family out of crypts and cleans them and has a party with them. There's really neat drawings in this. Let me see if I can find one. There's one family hanging out with their dead. This book was it was really interesting. It was not quite as good as Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. I did enjoy it though. It brings a lot of thought to the forefront about some of the issues that we as Americans particularly have with death and with dealing with our dead, and how we've become very hands-off. We don't want to be involved in a lot of the burials. We don't want to clean the bodies. We don't want to care for the bodies. Whereas in many other countries, that's what they do. The families prepare the bodies. They take care of the bodies. In some cases, the bodies might live with them, sometimes for years. I don't know that I would feel very comfortable with that. And again, as an outsider looking in, a lot of this seems very weird and kind of ick, but I am glad that she told me about it. It also brings out some interesting ideas of things that are in the process of, they are looking at, even in America, composting bodies. Although according to where they were when this book was written, they still had a long way to go. There was still a lot of issues with getting it just right to compost. But it's interesting what we're trying to do to learn about the best ways to continue caring for our dead, because there's a lot of people, cemeteries, space is limited, a lot of people choose cremation, but that takes a lot of fuel, and there are other choices. It's a good book, 4 out of 5. I did have a good time. All right, so I did read a few more. I just need to consult my list to make sure I don't miss any. Okay, it looks like I've got 3 more. I read Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin. This one was a hard one to rate. It is Darwin's scientific work on why he believes evolution is the way that humans got here and creatures got here, and how he thinks things change. And my understanding is he was very much a religious man. He went and did a lot of traveling and started noticing things and seeing things that made him think, wait a second. This is probably not a grand designer who created each individual creature, but a creature who is changed. And he looked particularly at the domestication of animals and of plants, because we can see that. There is no question that we as humans have intervened and changed certain plants and animals through domestication and through selective breeding. And he hypothesized that nature selectively bred as well, although not for the same things humans did. We, as humans, have selectively bred to make animals more useful, to give them certain traits, to make them cute, all these things, whereas nature would do it for how whoever is surviving the best will have the most offspring, and therefore those traits will live on and continue, where traits that are not as useful will die, and these can change over time. This book was so hard to rate because I thought about importance-wise, it was probably a 5. My enjoyment-wise, it was probably like a 2.5. This book was so long. I listened to it on audio, and I'm glad I did, because I don't think I could have got through it in a paperback. Darwin is great, but oh my goodness, he just cites and cites and cites. And in this instance, and I was thinking that, and I don't know what a lot of these critters are, because he's a big into pigeons, and I don't know much about pigeons, so the different kinds of pigeons didn't really make any difference to me. And I think some of the animals he talked about were stuff, I don't know if we call them something different, or if I'm just not familiar with them, but He has good arguments. I think his work is sound, but by golly, it was a long book. It was a long book, and when it was over, I was so glad to be over. I did decide ultimately to rate this a 4 because I think it is super important. I think Darwin did a great job with explaining things, and if I was more scientifically minded, I probably would have enjoyed it more. It just felt like such a long read. Such a long read. But I got through it, and it is an important book. The next book I read was American Crucifixion. The hypothesis or premise of this book, I guess, is that the founder of the Mormon Church, Joseph Smith, he was killed by a mob at Carthage jail. And I think the author was thinking that if he hadn't been killed, the Mormon religion would have probably phased out by now. And the book really just focuses on like what led up to his death, and then the aftermath. And among the aftermath was the Mormons moving out to Utah and creating the state there, and really growing and blossoming in the Utah territory, really expanding their families through polygamy. Also, the person who took over was Brigham Young, who did things differently than Joseph. And it was an interesting hypothesis. It was very much an interesting hypothesis that perhaps if Joseph had not been killed, none of us would have heard of the Mormon Church. It would have been a footnote in history, as some other religions that had popped up during that time were, and religious leaders who if we know of them at all, they're footnotes in history books. I gave this book a 4 out of 5. It was interesting. I did read the audiobook version. It was interesting. It was, I think if you are reading it as a Mormon, a hardcore Mormon, you will feel it's a little anti, but I didn't necessarily feel it was anti-Mormon. I felt it was very, felt it was very researched. There were quotes from Mormons of the time, but there were also quotes from other people. It talked a lot about some of the challenges the church was facing, particularly Joseph and his polygamy, and the complications with how people felt about polygamy. Also about Joseph's plans to kind of expand, almost create his own government. My understanding from reading this book, and I didn't really know this about Joseph, but it doesn't surprise me, is that he felt like Christ was going to be coming very soon, and he wanted to make sure that they started a political movement so that when Christ came, the church could just step in there and be at the right hand of Christ politically. It's some interesting stuff. I will say that as a former Mormon, this book was very emotional to read because I have a lot of feelings about some of the things with the church. When I was young, Joseph Smith was, next to Jesus in the We Love Him, He's amazing. You'd sing songs praising Him. One of my favorite hymns growing up was Praise to the Man, and it is a lovely song. But growing up and seeing a little bit more about who Joseph was, I'm a little uncomfortable with how I felt about Joseph Smith, because from everything I've read, it seems like he was maybe a little more than just a flawed religious leader. He seems a little crazy sometimes. And this book, did show that. It showed a lot of different sides of him and the Mormons and how things were. I did think it was a good book. I did think it was an informative book. I really am glad that I read it. I did feel so awful for his family and everybody who loved him when he died. They had a lot of quotes from different people who were there when the announcement was made, they have like his mother and what she had to say. She couldn't believe that, because Joseph and his brother Hiram both were killed in the same instance. They were in jail. And I will say, it was awful how they died, and absolutely inappropriate. The authorities, there should have been a lot more punishment. They were in prison for, I believe, an attack on a printing press. It could have been one of the other issues they were having. They ended up in prison quite a bit, but they'd been told they could have safe passage if they turned themselves in and awaited trial. And that didn't happen. Instead, a mob broke into the jail, There's some question of whether the people who were supposed to be guarding them just didn't do their jobs and maybe wanted them to die. We don't know. These people broke into the jail and killed Joseph and his brother Hiram, and they injured one of the other two people who were being held there. The other guy ended up not being terribly injured. Like, he had very minor wounds, but yeah, it was a heavy-hitting read. So I'm glad I read it. I'm not sure who I would recommend it to, because if you're currently a Mormon, you probably aren't going to enjoy it. And unless you have a scholarly interest in Mormonism, I'm not sure how much you'll care. But I, as somebody who was that faith and left the faith, but am still very interested in Mormon history, I really thought it was a well done book. I did enjoy it. The last book of the month was The Fiction Formula. This is another writer's book, and it is a companion to Write, Publish, Repeat. It is not directly related. It is not a sequel. Where Write, Publish, Repeat is about marketing and mindset, this is very much more about how to write fiction. And what I mean is they talk about understanding tropes, they talk about beats, they talk about plotting versus pantsing, they talk about different production and post-production and launch things. This was another book I had a hard time rating. I absolutely loved Write, Publish, Repeat, and I gave it a 5-star, and it was one that I read when I was first starting in writing and publishing. This book, I'm giving 5 stars, but it wasn't necessarily a 5-star for me. It was like a 4.5. I think this is a 5-star book, and it is one that I would give to anybody who is kind of entering into writing. Anybody who's published like 5 or less books, who's still kind of trying to find their way, who's in that voracious learning place. This is an amazing book, and like I read it and just wanted to buy it for everybody in my book club or writers group, which is why if I feel that way, obviously I kind of have to give it a 5, because it really is a good book, and I think it is a must-have for every newer author. The reason it was a little less than a 5-star for me on a personal level is just that I have read so much, and there wasn't a lot in this book that was absolutely new to me. There was a couple pearls of special wisdom in there, a couple things I really enjoyed or that really jumped out at me as like, oh, okay. But it didn't have the life-changing impact on me that Write, Publish, Repeat did. And part of that too is probably because I am at least 15 novels in. So things like, I have a pretty good system as far as knowing where on the plotting pantsing thing I sit. I understand genre. I understand beats of a story. I understand 3-act structure. There's a lot of things I get. And so much of this book was much more basic stuff, and I was hoping, because Write, Publish, Repeat felt a little more advanced, that this book would be more advanced. Now, I will say, when it came to the later half of the book, the post-launch stuff, that I really did enjoy, particularly like having a long-term author career and some of the things like keeping your backlist healthy. All of those were valuable to me, and so I did take something away from this. But again, this is much more for a person in the early stages of their writing career and not so much for a writing veteran. So take that how you will. It was definitely a 5-star for, like, I think most people it should be a 5-star. It has great information. This is the book that I think every author should have on their shelves. Someday when I have the money, I'm going to buy it for every member of my writers group because it was just that good. But again, if you have written 15, 20 books and have done the self-publishing thing, a lot of this will probably be stuff you've heard before. All right, guys, that was my month of November, mostly nonfiction. I will say, as you can tell, I had mostly high-rated stuff. I only had like 2, 3 stars, and everything else was 4 and up, if you don't count the 2 DNFs. But I will tell you, and I think this is just nonfiction, it didn't feel as fun as a typical reading month. I didn't love these books nearly as much as I typically do. I don't have the same amount of passion for them as I typically do at the end of the month for fiction books, which I'm not sure what that says about me, because I do like me a nonfiction, but I'm definitely not as passionate about nonfiction as maybe some other people are. So I'm glad that I had a month where it was almost all nonfiction. I am so glad in December to be getting back to fiction books. All right, guys, this is Jane. I will see you next time. My social media is below. Please remember to like and subscribe. Also, I'm an author. Links to my books are below as well. If you read historical romance and don't mind a little bit of paranormal in there, check me out on Kindle Unlimited. See you next time. Bye.